Alright, next we're going to move on to more of the physiology for the eye and look at the chemistry of visual pigments in rods and cones. We'll start with rods. They're a little simpler. So there is a light-absorbing molecule called retinal that combines with one of 4 proteins or opsins to form a complete visual pigment. Now retinal, which is in rods, is synthesized from vitamin A. And there's 2 different forms of retinal. There's 11-cis retinal, which is a bent form of the chemical, and all-trans retinal, which is a straight form of the chemical. And when rods absorb light, it turns the bent form of retinal into the straight form of retinal. So again, that occurs, the bent to straight form, when the pigments, so retinal plus an opsin, absorbs light. And that's going to be what we need to convert and initiate a reaction that leads to an electrical impulse that moves along the optic nerve. So let's look at an overview. So this process that we're talking about is called phototransduction, which is a set of steps at the molecular level that, for rods, turn them off, allowing the rods to inform other cells that light is present and the brain needs to comprehend visual stimuli picked up by other photoreceptors. So it's that retinal shape change that initiates the rhodopsin pigment to also change shape and starts a cascade of events that allows a graded potential to be turned into an action potential and to travel to the brain. So again, phototransduction is the process by which light energy is converted into a graded potential. So it's going to really rely on that key light absorbing molecule retinal, its combination with opsin, like rhodopsin, a visual pigment, the change of shape of retinal, which changes the shape of opsin, which creates the graded potential that gets to leave via the optic nerve as an action potential. Now when we're talking about rods, we're talking mainly about retinal and opsins, and the pigment for rods oftentimes is rhodopsin. It's a deep purple pigment. But for cones, there's multiple pigments, and they produce blue, red, and green cones, named for the color of light each cone absorbs best. So when it comes to cones and color perception, it's actually possible to get really good high acuity color perception by activating more than one cone at a time. Here we can take a closer look at what we're talking about. So we're going back to the rods because they're simpler. Rods are rod-shaped at the end, but actually they have multiple round discs that create that kind of blunt rod shape at the end. In the cell membranes of these discs, you actually find embedded different types of pigments called opsins, like rhodopsin, and inside of these pigments that are in these membranes would be the light absorbing molecules like retinal. When light hits the retinal in this membrane inside its pigment, it goes from that bent to straight form, and that would be pigment bleaching. And that occurs after pigment synthesis and before pigment regeneration. Because after light hits retinal and it changes shape and it changes the shape of opsin, we actually get processing to a graded potential and then eventually an action potential. But then we have to regenerate that pigment and then regenerate the retinal so that we can keep using these rods. And that's what we're seeing in this image. So you're seeing the rod being triggered when light hits it, producing pigment bleaching. So that was light absorption by rhodopsin that triggers a rapid series of steps in which the bent form of retinal changes to the straight form of retinal. But we want to regenerate that pigment and also resynthesize the bent form of retinal. So this can keep happening. Other things we can talk about besides the chemistry of how rods work are just simple things like eye infections. Chalazion is an infection of the tarsal gland resulting in a cyst. A stye is inflammation of any of the smaller glands. If you have watery eyes, it might be because you have nasal inflammation and it's constricting or blocking the nasolacrimal duct and preventing tears from draining. And conjunctivitis is inflammation of the conjunctiva. We oftentimes call it pink eye. We also have some disorders of vision. Diplopia is double vision, which is when muscle movements are not coordinated. Strabismus is when someone's cross-eyed. Weakness of eye muscles could be one or both eyes, or one or both eyes to different extents. Retinal detachment, pigmented and nervous areas separate, usually from a blow to the head where you get aqueous humor seeping between these areas. you would start to see if this happens to you. Kind of your vision become dark at the edges and then almost completely disappear. When that starts to happen, you want to get to the doctor as soon as possible. It is possible to reverse retinal detachment if it's caught early. We've already briefly talked about glaucoma, which is pressure in the eye that compresses the optic nerve and can lead to blindness, and clouding of the lens, which is a cataract. But we haven't talked about color blindness, which is a congenital lack of one or more of the cone types, and night blindness, which can be caused by vitamin A deficiency, but it's when rod function is hampered or something's wrong with the functioning of your rods. Alright, next we're going to be looking at our chemical senses. So when it comes to the chemical senses, we're looking at taste and smell, or gustation, which is taste, and smell, which is olfaction. So make sure to come back for that video.